commerce, in politics, which is all spread then in other places throughout the region as we're looking at this. There are just some things to think about here. These are anthropological terms, and I'll go through here because most of you aren't anthropologists, and this gets into sort of heady stuff that we have. But the notion of analysis we have, a heterarchy is a linkage that we have then of largely horizontally linked communities, all of about the same degree of importance and all things, but as opposed to a hierarchy, which is up and down. In this case, this is sort of the lateral that we see here. And for much of what we see in the early trading patterns and such, it's again, the heterarchy is the way we start this whole process. A cosmopolis in this case becomes a horizontally linked community, or series of communities then, and with potentials then of hierarchy within these. Malacca would have some dominance in their period of time, for example, as opposed to those that are linked. But this is sort of a complexity. And in network theory, which I work in heavily in this case, and I'm not going to get into this, but what I do then is go back and trace these connections and develop whether, again, this is a parallel or whether it's a hierarchical relationship and what the nature of this thing is. This gets into the complexity then of the type of writings we do then of working at these network theory systems that we see here. For those of you that are interested in this, a lot of this comes out of the School of French Studies that have developed in urban studies in the last 20 years or thereabouts, with lots of application in terms of anthropological analysis that goes with this in time. So the cosmopolis that is here is the ultimate. The other part of this, for some of you that know this background, especially Sheldon Pollock, as we look at his idea of the Sanskrit cosmopolis in this case, he plays with this in the notion in a way that has been challenged, because it argues the foundational values of Indian Sanskritic tradition as areas of Southeast Asia, Bay of Bengal, basically are articulating into this system. The place that I have a problem with this is it's ultimately basically South Asian imperialist, let's say, in terms of the methodologies that are here, and seeing people basically, from his perspective, associated with this, and the very South Asia-centeredness that is here. And a lot of the work I've done, particularly in the use of Javanese literature, is refute that, basically. And seeing, particularly in the local literature, how people are, the term I would use in English is cherry picking. They selectively take these things as it is appropriate and maintain their own cultural traditions that are here, and selectively using something that is in their own agency, as opposed to someone else doing this. Here's our heterarchy networking that we see, and really what you have are family centers. By family, I'm talking about ancestral and family linkages that you have in various communities, from villages on up here, and the complexities we see here. But we especially see in this case are monasteries and temples, and especially court-linked things that are taking place here, and how these all sort of become linked in primary centers and secondary centers and all this, and with the issues of knowledge flows that are important here. And I'll talk a little bit more about knowledge flows as I go along. But this is the anthropology of history that we're working with, and looking at this connectivity that is here. And in looking at the Bay of Bengal region, I'll put in the details that go in this network that we see, and working from the top down and bottom up as we see this. But this is, again, trying to analyze how things fit together. This is the big difference of what we see in the new history today, because the history in the past has been focused upon individual sites, or the big history, which is Indianization of these things. We're getting at this level right now that's looking at the details that are here in new ways. And again, the data that we're using, that I'll talk about real briefly in this case, allows us to transitions in terms of analysis. This is what all of you are doing. You're all diplomats, most of you in this case. Isn't this what you're about too? Trying to figure out the details of linkage, trying to make sense of them. You look at here. We'll talk about this. Think about that. It's good. When I talk about zones of encounter, those transition points that we see here in a contact age. And what I'm describing is indeed a contact age that begins in the early centuries AD, not before. And I'm taking this up until 1500 for what I do, but I also extend this sometimes when I'm working in the period after this period of time, when we have the Europeans coming up, which is a new age of contact we see in place. With this periodization then in different contact periods of people and cultures that will go with this. This is a popular new approach that we take too. Borderless societies. I would argue generally that the Bay of Bengal is a borderless society that is here. And I can back it up, too, believe me, as I do this. Where we're not looking at imperialism or dominance in this case, but really a complexity then of a flow pattern that is here of people communicating and working together in various ways in a borderless type of zone that we find here. The literature on this really began by analyzing the border between China and Southeast Asia, and also carrying over into South Asia that we should look at too, and that South China border, the next extension here. But looking a lot at what is happening not in eastern China, where the monarchy is here, but looking at the border zones and how things are so different. And if you know anything about Chinese politics and all this is a problem in China right now, in terms of, again, the identities and other things that are taking place in this border zone, which is that southern border zone and all the border zones in general that China has in their deep interior that is here and the consequences thereof. But again, that's what we see in Southeast Asia. As I look at the Bay of Bengal, I consider the Bay of Bengal then and approach it in the context of, from beginning with the idea of a borderless zone and begin to work from that basis that we see here. Again, diasporas, we've talked about them in essence, but this is an important part of the analytical that we see. All right, here I identify at 1000 AD linkage to the Middle East that is developing this period of time. And what we find in this case is an outreach coming out of the Middle East in terms of trading connections. And this is where we really see the element then of the wider Indian Ocean transit taking place and cultural exchanges and otherwise that are here. As you have Middle East and extending down to the Northeast African coastline as a part of this whole transit zone that we see in place, which is a replication which Zheng He, back in the early 1400s from China, then covers this entire zone in his voyages, you see, which is very significant in the context of what we're talking about. But this larger notion then of contact that we see. I recognize in particular something that's readily accessible. Travels in Batuta, which is really looking at this period, 1400s as we're looking at that. And Tomé Pires, who's there as a Portuguese then in the early 1500s we see, and how they become accessible sources of this idea of contact zones and all the things I'm talking about, as in their periods of time they recognize this stuff in here. All right. I was told to talk about historical sources, and this is what we're looking at, and I'll go through these quickly, but this is what we use in terms of data analysis here. Text, Tomé Pires, right? In Batuta. Journals, chronicles here. Government and commercial documents. My career began really looking at temple inscriptions in South India. Here. The temple inscriptions have a religiosity, but they're also public record that we see. They engage in all sorts of economic transactions and transactions of monarchies and crossovers that occur out of this, but they are a vital source then of reconstructing really South Indian history, as equally as the case as I work in Southeast Asia, where those inscriptions become an invaluable part then of recording then the society's history as this period of time. Archaeological in this case, temples, mosques to enter in this, especially as we see these mosques beginning in the 15th century and carrying over from that period of time, if not earlier. Political, urbanisms, rural areas in this case, the archaeology we were just doing in northeast Cambodia, had a lot to do with agricultural transitions, water management systems, ecological, and seeing this as foundational to other things. Shipwrecks, production centers. I use the example of tin mines as one among others. Plantations in a later period of time, rubber, palm. Think about the complexity of coconut palms relative to the regional history right now and the consequences here. As we look at rice again here. Maritime passageways, connectivities, and how the Strait of Malacca is a really valuable part that is here, as we see. But equally, for a certain period of time, going across the Kra Isthmus of Malaysia was a big deal here. Why? Because of the physicality. Going across that Kra Isthmus saves you a heck of a lot of sailing time here. Translating the present, we're talking about putting a new canal across there, aren't they? You aware of that? Again, the new speculation is as opposed to going through Singapore, you're going to put a new canal across the Kra Isthmus. It's going to save a lot of time in terms of navigation into the Bay of Bengal that comes out of this in time. Chinese are pushing this. There's a lot of resistance in other places because of, again, the fear of Chinese dominance in this whole process. So it's a hot issue, politically speaking, here. But it's largely a repetition then of early history where this was the way across. And so you know all that way space here. This is 15th century, an Arab navigator describing the people of the Bay of Bengal. These are bad people who do not know any rules. The infidel marries the Muslim, and the Muslim infidel woman. And when you call them infidels, are you really sure they are infidels at all here in time? And the Muslims of whom you speak, are they really Muslims? They drink wine in public and do not pray when they set out. This here. You see again places like river systems and valleys and otherwise they're very productive ice places in this instance, and how the mountains act as barriers that make up and go down here. This makes a lot of sense. We have a transit points we see. We begin to look at this. The Malay Peninsula that we've looked at and in Sumatra, and especially northern Sumatra relative to the Bay of Bengal. Aceh, we also know that one, don't we? Okay. On the tip. But the Samudra Pasai that predates Aceh here is the predecessor in terms of these connections that we see. Social networking. I'm meeting up time. I want to get through here, but let me kind of go through. And just, again, these are patterns we use in trying to make sense of flow patterns. There's another one that we see. Specifically in this instance, I'm interested in knowledge networks and the transmission of a little detail here. I'm not going too much on this. This is the really new stuff that is here. And I just finished a conference in India in which we were looking at this in terms of, centered in Calcutta, looking at this Indian Ocean, then from, again, an Indian base in Calcutta. We're looking at this in terms of the consequences. Okay, number one is the development of Tantric Buddhism, and especially as we look at this Theravada Buddhism that we see coming out of this. At the basic level, a lot of the research is looking at Malay society, namely upstream societies that are here, and projecting in particular the fact that they don't embrace then the mainstreams of Buddhism, but are very selective of what they do. And most of this goes into traditions of spirit worship, and where there's a strong continuity of spirit worship that is here. This involves a whole lot of ethnographic study work that is here. And there's some new books that have just come out that are post-dating that at about the 1960s, where Winstead is the name here. We did a book called Malay Magic that is here, but we're doing follow-up on that in terms of ethnographic work, especially looking at the prevalence and continuity then of spirit worship. And then, in fact, my first slide that I did of the spirit worship type of consequence up in the Java Highland is a good example of how there are these continuities that are there. Very much a part of this. Theravada Buddhism. Nalanda is the source, but this is the first real structural networking that we see in the Bay of Bengal. Why? Because the Buddhism is coming out of the that is happening in Nalanda in the top. It is finding its way down to Sri Lanka in a direct way. Some of it's spreading into South India. Go from here and go over to the Malay Peninsula, especially the area of Tombalinga, the Isthmus type of areas that we see, and how that projects itself up into basically the Chao River system into the Thai situation that we see here, and largely basically modern Thai monarchy that drives these contact of this period of time that we see. Going up to Myanmar. Myanmar is a major source of this, because the Bagan kingdom that is up there this period of time has a rough time in terms of who's on first between the temples and the Buddhist church, and again that of the Bagan monarchy here. The way the monarchs resolve this is they intervene as a secular force to cleanse a corrupt monastic order here. And the way they do it is largely then by forcing a group of monks to go down to Sri Lanka to undergo reordination. Empowerment. Once they are reordained, they go back to Myanmar, and every monk in Myanmar has to be quizzed then of whether they are true to the faith. And the consequence is that the bad apples in the system from the state's perspective are out here, essentially. But again, you do this using the Buddhist system of reordination and enacted empowerment of the monarchy, but also re-empowerment then of the Buddhist church along the way. It's a unique situation we find. And what is significant about this, I just went through all those places that I just went through in the Bay of Bengal, all of them buy into the system basically here. And this becomes the basis of Thai, Buddhism, and others that follow again this reconvening, restructured Theravada tradition, and sort of networking that comes out of this in complexity. So again, this Malacca, Sumatra, mixed multicultural zones that are here. And this is where we begin to get into the elements then of Islam really here as a part of the system. And really multiculturalism is Sunni, Shia, and Sufi Islam that we see. Sufi especially tending to be consistent with a lot of traditional indigenous worship that we find, and the Sunni and the Shia representing then different ways of going through this, and how this has a direct contact into a place like Aceh that buy heavily into the they become a center then of Islam in the entire region. Samudra before this period of time is doing similar in this instance. And the Portuguese were promoting Christianity, obviously, here, and things will follow with the Dutch. In India, the mainstream of Hinduism that we see, and especially the development of India's Bhakti tradition, spiritualist type of Hinduism that we see, and the importance of that, especially coming out of South India, that is my work in this instance. A lot of my work in the Chola dynasty is looking at similar to what we find the Buddhist networking that I just described in Theravada Buddhism and reordination and things like this. The Chola monarchy does this largely by networking with Bhakti Hinduism here and promoting temples that are directly linked then to this Bhakti Hinduism spread effect. And there are two mother temples in this. Chidambara is one and Srirangam is the other one in South India. They're the mother temples in this instance. The source then are equally things that are going on in Buddhism around the same time, roughly speaking.